In the gay community, there are a few topics as provocative as who is a top, who is a bottom, or who is a verse. These positions are about more than just where the dick is going, but are also used to determine one's gender presentation beyond the bedroom, one's relationship to power, and much more. In addition to carrying on like sometimes boring entire concepts of power, woman, and man, these roles have also been critiqued as being ableist, transphobic, some even say sexist. So today on Brunch with the Boys, we're going to take some time to share our own personal stories of how we each first came to understand top, bottom, and verse, and what our initial perception was when we first told about these roles. Now, while we plan to have a fun and potentially messy conversation about these things, we want to be very clear that today there will not be any top worship or bottom shaming that is so integral to how our communities kind of have these conversations. We just want to be very clear, just so you know. And the shade stone will be handy to make sure that we keep the conversation on track. Of course, if you are watching and you want to be a part of the conversation beyond just this video, you can go to brunchwiththeboys.org to learn more about our weekly Twitter chat and also learn about our other different programs we have going on. If you're following us on Twitter, you can follow us at BrunchWTheBoys, and you can also like us on Facebook. So that being said, we have, of course, some amazing, brilliant men with me today. First off, I want to start by introducing Mr. Aaron Talley, who's with us. Aaron, say what's up.
What's up?
So Aaron is out of Chicago, because we cross the country all with everything. Aaron is out of Chicago. He's actually getting ready to graduate with his master's in teaching, correct, Aaron? Right? Yes. Aaron is also a writer who's contributed to the Black Youth Project and Muse Magazine, among other places. And he's also a Scorpio, which, once again, we have too many Scorpios on the show. Nice. All righty. Thanks for joining us, Aaron. It's great to have you on.
Thank you.
Next, we have Chase Simmons. Chase is, among many things, of course, he is the creator and the producer of Dear Dad, Letters from Same-Gender Loving Sons, which is a really popular documentary that's been screening all over the country, and it's really fabulous, even though I wasn't asked to be in it. But once again, it's really fabulous.
Oh, geez.
He's also a photographer. He's a director. He's super talented. He also edits the Brunch with the Boys videos for us and makes sure that all the inappropriate shit that we say doesn't make it on air and we don't get sued. Thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being with us today, Chase.
Thanks for having me.
And next we have Kenyon Farrow out of D.C. I forgot to mention Chase is actually out of Atlanta, so we get a little bit of everywhere. Kenyon Farrow's out of D.C. Kenyon is the current reigning shade queen of Brunch with the Boys. He's also, I don't know if I told you, Kenyon, that our conversation on the swirl got much hits and many retweets about the he's the connoisseur of swirl education, okay? No, but Kenyon is a longtime activist and writer, organizer, activist, writer who's spoken and pretty much written for every publication that we care about and every university that you care about or ever will go to. He's also the former executive director of Queers for Economic Justice and the current global policy director of Treatment Action Group. So he's very fancy, and we're excited to have him on, as always.
Thank you, boo.
All right, last but not least, I'm your host. My name is Yolo Akili, and if you're watching, make sure you check out brunchwiththeboys.org and follow us on Twitter at BrunchWTheBoys. We are on Twitter every Sunday from 1 p.m. to 2 p.m. Eastern, having conversations about this video and much more. So, that being said, today's topic is the truth about tops and bottoms. Let's start sharing our stories and having the conversation about what our experiences are.
I guess I'll start. So, I'm a native Atlantan. Yes, I know. How awful. No, but my initial experience and, kind of foraying into sex in my early 20s, I was very kind of curious as to, I didn't really know about tops and bottoms initially. Like, I watched porn, of course, but they don't necessarily give titles and roles. It's just, people go in and do what they feel most comfortable doing. So, and initially when I was dating, the first introduction is typically online, so I kept getting that question. And at the time, I didn't have really an answer. And I didn't realize how infuriating that was to some guys. They were just like, what do you mean you don't know? How can you not know? You're either a top or a bottom. And then the whole verse situation came in, and I was just like, well, maybe I'm both. And then personally for me, I realized that I was none because it really was dependent on who I was with and the vibe that we had and the conversations that we had and the kind of energy that we had at that night in that particular sexual instance. But I do find it's challenging to find other people that are that flexible. And it's not even like, I don't even consider sex as something, as always penis going into some orifice. You know what I'm saying? Like, so in my experience, it's been challenging because I feel like it's just so narrow well, I won't say we, but how some guys see it and experience sex. And it's all about a dick going into an ass. Like, that is sex point blank. And I just don't agree at all. And I also feel like we miss out on a lot of intimacy and pleasure by being so narrow. And I feel like a lot of it, some of it's self-imposed, but I feel like some people get placed in these roles. I know you said a few minutes ago, like, in terms of gender presentation and just overall look, some people are like, oh, well, you're kind of effeminate, I just assume you're a bottom, or, well, you seem very masculine, aren't you a top? And I feel like that gets very dangerous. And I also feel like it contributes to a lot of the, I don't know, I guess I'll call it the missed connections. I feel like there would be a lot more free-flowing dating activity, especially in cities like Atlanta, if people are just a little more flexible and open and just wanted to experience sex on a one-on-one level as opposed to this is my stamped label on my forehead and it's what I do. If you don't do that, then I can't help you.
Wow. Chase, can you tell me a little bit more? Because I mean, and like all the things that are really relevant and really powerful. I would love to hear more about like your particular feelings or your experience when you say you were online initially, and these men were like really frustrated and angry with you. You were saying like they were like mad at you for not like adhering to a particular label. Because I feel like that's something that happens a lot in our community. Like whenever you're in a space and you don't really explicitly say what you are, people assume one, you're a bottom because the bottom is considered to be something you would be ashamed of to not actually express, or that you actually enjoy penetration would be something to be ashamed of. But I'm just really curious, like more about hearing more about how that felt for you on the receiving end of this kind of like push to be like, well, what are you? Why aren't you taking on one of these roles or these identities? Like, what was that like for you?
It was jarring and frustrating, and at the time, like I didn't know how bottoming felt. You know what I'm saying? It looked, to be quite frank with you, it looked rather painful. So I was like, I don't know, maybe it was something that I did eventually try, and I would say the first couple times I was not a fan, like at all. Mm-hmm. But you grow into certain things. But yeah, it was very like, and I would say when I first started out, I did attract a lot of, how shall I put this, trade pieces. So they would be like, yo, what up? So what's good? You wanna, can I come through? You a bottom, you suck dick, blah 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 blah. And I'd be like, okay, well, I'm Chase. Nice to meet you. What is your name? Etc. and so on. So it was just, for a while it was frustrating because I was just like, is something wrong with me? Like, am I doing this wrong? Do I have unrealistic expectations? And I found out that I did. So, yeah.
Very interesting. A lot of interesting points in that particular conversation. Like I feel a lot of people, I know I empathize when I hear that. Kenyon, what's your story, Kenyon? Like, what was your experience with those labels and identities?
Yeah, it's interesting listening to Chase because as the older doll on the panel today, and despite how completely snatched I appear, I'll be 40 in November, and so I'm thinking about the time, like when I came out, 20 years ago, before, the internet was really, a thing. And so I just was kind of processing my own kind of experience of like, kind of first coming out as gay, and in thinking about actually in some ways how some of it is about how the internet has kind of changed, because so much of our kind of interactions or the way we get introduced sexually now is very sort of transactional. And those negotiations were always there with the people, having public sex or other kinds of ways people were engaging that might be more anonymous. But like with the internet, it's just very clear, like, are you not, what, like the level of negotiation is sort of less, right? So that's interesting. But, my personal story, so, as I say to people a lot, I grew up, with other kind of LGBT, queer, whatever, people in the life around me, in my family, friends of the family, what have you. So I always knew what gay was. I always knew what, gay sex was on some level. But in kind of where I grew up in like the hood in Cleveland in the like 80s and 90s, there wasn't really a like, top, bottom. That wasn't really part of the way I kind of understood it. I didn't learn what that meant until I went to college. And, then the kind of descriptors of like top, bottom became much more kind of, pronounced, or ways I kind of started to understand them. I think for me personally, what's interesting is, I had a really kind of interesting, kind of set of dynamics that were partly about gender, partly about a range of things. So like when I first started kind of having sex with men, I was 19, and which for some people is late. Some of my friends are like, oh, that's late. Like, people kind of just started earlier, but for me, I didn't like start hooking up with, and I didn't have any anal sex, penetrative or receptive, until I was like 24, almost 25. And so, and so kind of early on, there were those kinds of negotiations where I knew I wasn't ready for it. And so I just didn't I just didn't do it until I felt ready for it. And then once I started, kind of having, penetrative sex with men or whatever, at the time in my life, I was gendered much more femme than I am now, right? So it's partly like more femme. I was like skinnier than I am now by like about 40, 45 pounds. And I was kind of like, what the kids would now call like an Afro punk, right? When there was no label for it. We just were like these random kind of black people who just, were a little bit like the Denise Huxtables of the world, that nobody really knew what to do with, right? Like there was no label for it. So for me, like, when I moved to New York in '99, I was 24. I started to have these experiences with brothers who just didn't know, because I wasn't, that was the height of kind of homo thuggery, and people just didn't know where to place me. And I feel like it does feel like something that is kind of feels more intense to me in our community, that like the way people both gender you becomes a conversation about top or bottom, right? That feels really just this, very kind of one side or the other. So I had a lot of experiences where people didn't quite know what to do with me, because I wasn't really like a femme queen, but I wasn't like trying to be in Tim's and like that either, right? So I would like get either a lot of confusion, or I would meet a lot of like, as Chase said, trade, who were actually bottoms. And for some reason, it always surprised me that they would like, that somebody like me, I always think that those kind of dudes would want somebody who was equally or more masculine than them to top them. But that was not the case. For like a long time, I was like fucking all these like, really butch tops. And not like that's like, like, I'm not like bragging about it in that particular way, but it was an interesting sort of dynamic that was different from what you would sort of assume, right? And and then when I got into like my first kind of real relationship in my later 20s, like 27, 28, I started to kind of play with more versatility or whatever, as time went on, and so those things have always kind of shift depending on the relationship, depending on the interaction now, or whatever.
Hmm. Hmm. Very interesting. Very, very interesting. Hmm. So it's really interesting, Kenya, the piece where you talk about like and I would love to hear this a little bit more about the piece when you talk about like this, being in this particular space, a gendered space where people were not able to really kind of look at you and say this is what he does in the bedroom based on what we're getting, right? You know what I mean?
Right.
So like you talk about like being kind of Afro punk before there was a concept of Afro punk, right? And then like a lot of black folks are a lot of people in general is being like, okay, well, that's not homo thug, you know, he ain't got a lace front. Like what do I do? What do I do? I don't know what to do. And it's
Right.
It's go ahead, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, that was the deal, and it didn't start. It started to shift probably around maybe like 2005 or so, and I started to notice, like, I always describe it this way, like one week I went to the club with like the same, you know, $1.85 jacket that I thrifted,
Yeah.
you know, to Esplanade in New York. I had the you know the same shit I was rocking, you know, one week, and nobody talked to me, right? Like nobody even tried to holler at me. Till the next week or 2 weeks later, whatever it was, wore the same jacket to the same club, and all of a sudden, you know, people were like, I remember one night getting 4 compliments on that jacket, and then like I think 2 of the dudes like asked me if I did spoken word and whatever, and I was like, hell no.
Oh, Lord.
Hey, honey.
And so part of what happened, right, I feel like once a kind of like, you know, D'Angelo, Maxwell, Raphael Sadiq kind of all of a sudden became this category of black masculinity that was like acceptable or like or eroticized, you know, after a little bit of time, then all of a sudden it felt like people sort of thought they knew where to place me in some way, you know, so people always thought I had weed, right?
Wow. Nice.
These assumptions, right? So, you know, so for me, it was like very much a like, you know, way in which like, you know, kind of way people read gender also shifted what people sort of desired from you and what they thought, you know, that was both, you know, about kind of top bottom stuff and then some other assumptions about, you know, class and all these other pieces wrapped up in it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Very, very interesting. Very, very interesting. And I see you over there making a face like you were making some faces like you had some reactions. Tell me what these faces about.
I'm like, dang, can we do a part 2? Because I feel like I could just be listening this entire time. No, I mean, I think what I like about what Chase and Ken are saying is like so much of these categories is just way more fluid. And I think we as a community just need to accept that these things are fluid across like stages of our lives. So I'm thinking about, so like just I'm 22, so in a lot of ways I still like I'm still in that process of figuring out all the different things about who I am and what I like and what I prefer and all these other things. And I'm thinking about how in high school, you know, I feel like we like a lot of people in high school always had that like best friend who was really like their first boyfriend and like you confided in them and all this other stuff. And so he and I would, you know, we would mess around and we knew about those labels, but we like knew about the labels without the politics of those labels, you know? And so we were always, you know, playing around, doing different things, you know, assuming like more like top positions, bottom positions, that type of thing. And it was never really like, I remember us having conversations about like, oh, maybe you do this and maybe you do that. You know, it wasn't like this, like, that means you're more masculine or less feminine.
Oh, Aaron? Oh, we lost him for a second. See if he comes back in. Aaron? Okay, we'll have to edit this part out if he doesn't come back in. Let's see if he comes back in.
Yeah.
It was getting good too, honey. He was about to go ham. Aaron, are you still there? All right, so we're gonna just. Oh, wait. Okay, so we're gonna carry on. So, let's talk a little bit about my experience. You know, I think that before I even knew what the labels and the identities, before I knew about like top and bottom, I was kind of like people. Before I actually had heard those terms, I was pushed into a receptive role, and I think a large part of that was kind of like about my skin color, or my height. You know, I mean, there was an assumption that like this is what you must be doing. So I never felt like I really had any agency initially in my first sexual experiences in terms of being able to define and figure out what I wanted. My first sexual experiences were primarily with men who were like, you know, closeted Greek guys, and I ain't gonna call the Greek organization out, but you know who you are. And so, so I never really had. There wasn't a space that was created between us where we could have that kind of dialogue. But I do remember, like, you know, my first couple of sexual experiences as primarily as a receptive partner. And I remember talking to some of my straight female friends about like not really liking it that much, like really being like, this wasn't great, like this isn't great, but I enjoy other parts of it, like you know the touch, the kiss. But I was like, I'm not really into this. And I remember and this is such a curious piece. I remember them telling me, well, generally you don't really like it. You know what I mean? They literally telling me like you don't really like it, like telling me that like them saying, you know, what I enjoy about this is actually that he likes it, and that's what I get off on. And that's what I was kind of encouraged to do sexually with men. Even though I wasn't finding this attractive or desirable, you know, I was expected to say, oh, this is actually, you should enjoy it because you are, because you should get off of it because he's getting off on it. Which is really just an interesting piece to like to say, like, you know, about sexuality and gender. So, you know, it wasn't until really like later on in my mid-20s that I was able to kind of like really kind of get some agency on my own sexuality and sexual desires, because there is a way in which the public perception of the way in which I move through space, what I would attract to me, what people would find, what people would assume about me was basically like this is all that you do, and that you have to have an identity based on that. Which is one of the reasons I've always been kind of like, was always awkward to me. Even when I started doing work with gay men, I was like, wait a second. If I'm a receptive or you know, penetrative partner, why do I have to build an identity around this? This is bizarre to me. It was really weird. Like my friend Jared says it very well. He says, when people use tops and bottoms as nouns instead of verbs, you need to watch out. And that's become very true in my life. When I hear somebody says he's a bottom or a top, there's often a lot more associated with that, or I'm a top, or even I'm a bottom. Yeah. You know, all these things, like when I hear it uses a noun, there tends to be a lot of gendered stuff in there, as opposed to when they say like I top or I bottom. Not always, but like I've just noted that sometimes there's a very distinct difference between how people like relate to those concepts. So for me particularly, I mean, I've always been kind of anti-top bottom verse, just in the sense of like I do think they are like very limited categories that erase the rest of your body and your sex. It's like it's all about your dick and your ass. Nothing else exists. Like, you know what I mean? I think they also kind of limit how people are able to understand power. It seems like it's very top bottom. It's hierarchy, right? You know what I mean? Like they implicitly imply hierarchy, and so people always ask like, who's the more dominant person or who's the more, you know, submissive? Well, power doesn't always operate in that simplistic frame, right? Sometimes people who are like, sometimes no one's more dominant. Like sometimes it's a little bit more complicated in terms of how our sexual relationship works. And so I think that it just very limits people. And I also think it's just like there's a way in which I know that people are doing work trying to like separate top and bottom from like man and woman, but I think that we just need new terms. We need new language. Because I think that top and bottom are always going to imply hierarchy. They're always going to be connected to some themes of masculinity, of man and woman, of power, etc. And I think that we need to figure out new terms and ways to name our sexualities and don't invoke those things. So then when I can say whatever I am, nobody immediately goes to, oh, that means these roles or these labels or this whatever that is. Because top and bottom still do that. And I think that they're very limiting. And so for me personally, I've always kind of been anti them, regardless of the fact that I do a range of sexual acts. Like I'm going to do it all. I'm going to do some of this. I ain't going to lie. I'm not bullying about that. You know what I mean? I don't have any shame around that. But, oh, hold on. But, yeah, so that's how my particular experience and kind of relationship to it has kind of been. Aaron, you got cut off. So I kind of like started going in. But please, can you pick up where you were talking? Like,
yeah, where did the internet try to shade me? Where did it?
No, they didn't shade you. Put the shade stuff on the internet.
Where'd I get cut off at? I can't remember.
It was toward the beginning. You were talking about sort of your initial experiences.
Okay, so basically my initial experiences, like I was saying, I had this sort of like best friend boyfriend who I used to like talk to, hang out with, and what I was saying was like we would kind of do it all, and we would even have conversations about like top, bottom, that type of thing, and we knew that language, but we didn't like have the politics behind it. And so we didn't connect it to like, oh, you're more feminine, you're more masculine because you're doing that type of thing. Versus the difference of when I went to college and one of my earlier relationships, you know, the guy was way more like restrictive about, you know, what we were able to do together. And so what I knew, what was hard was like I knew he identified as verse, you know, preferring to top, but at the same time he never wanted me to top him. And through conversation it became about like, and then I realized, you know, oh, that it was about him feeling like I was less feminine or that I was more feminine or just connected to all these ideas of like dominance and power. And because I didn't have enough of my own understanding of all these things, I really took that to heart. Like I was really upset about it. And, you know, I think that sort of affected me in future relationships with people until I finally started talking to people who were like, oh, let's do whatever. I'm down. Like, what you want to do? Let's have this, you know, and then that freed me in addition to my own sort of like politics evolving. And so what I think for me, what I'm finding out is as I continue to talk to sort of like some of the older gays or, you know, it's like a lot of them all have gone through these phases where they identified as one way and then they switched, then they started doing a little bit of this and then they did a little bit of that and then they switched. And so I think this is a key topic where intergenerational conversations between us have to be so important and so crucial because I think it allows us, like you said, Yolo, to have new language and to realize how constructed all of these things really are. You know, because I think everybody wants to date, but it's hard for us, you know, younger gays to be out here dating if we're dating based off this sort of like criteria and this list as opposed to who we are with this very narrow idea of, you know, sexuality and pleasure, that type of thing. So.
Absolutely. I think you bring up a really important piece about like, you know, like how the ways in which I think there's a question about like how does that inhibit our ability to love and embrace each other when we're kind of like, oh, you do that, I can't do that. You know what I mean? And I think we need to hold that conversation at the same time as we say that there are very clear, people have certain pleasure spaces. People have very distinct, like this is where I enjoy pleasure and I find pleasure. How do we hold that like this is your, you know, point of pleasure? How do we also hold that like so very rarely do top and bottom not often coincide with sometimes concepts of power, concepts of gender. Because there's even like people I know I've talked to recently talking about how they identified as bottom for a long time because they felt like they were too feminine to be tops, you know, or to even top men. Like saying like, so I felt like I just couldn't do that because I know who I am, I'm feminine. I just feel like it would be, you know, not attractive or desirable for me to even want to do that to a guy. You know what I mean? Or top people, a lot of guys who identify as tops who will say like, you know, I don't bottom because I think that that's kind of like demeaning or whatever all these narratives are. But it's really curious about like what could happen if we really unpack them and start like not only creating the language, but also just seeing how the ways in which they inhibit our ability to kind of be intimate with each other and in a myriad of different ways, you know. Yeah.
Yeah, and I want to also hold a space for people because I do think, you know, I don't necessarily think that we have to get to a kind of place where everyone's just like verse, for lack of a better word, right?
Right.
You know what I mean? So like people, there can be great power in like, you know, the kind of coming to an understanding of your sexuality, right? That may be for you on a scale of right here to here on this side or this side, right? The question is like, does that, you know, are you able to kind of embody that in ways that don't inhibit like your, you know, I guess liberation in other ways, right? Or place you in, you know, certain boxes or place you in relationships that you know, become constrained, right? Or certain expectations that don't allow you a space to grow. So I think like to me that's the piece of it because I think, you know, identity in a range of different ways can be very powerful, be a way to kind of begin to kind of understand, you know, your body and time and space and relationship to others and what have you. But then how does, you know, how does that kind of entry point then become a kind of a road, right, of a way of exploring, right, and not a cage.
Right. And I think that's the piece of what I was saying about new language. Like, I'm not like, I think we need to be careful too, Kenyon. Not saying that people, if you enjoy primarily, if you enjoy penetration, but it's also interesting to me too, because it's like, well, hold up, I like having my nipples licked too, and my neck bit too. I don't feel a need to build an identity around that. Like, some of that's patriarchy, right? Like, why do we feel like that has to be like, that needs to be built upon that?
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, I'm not going around and saying, girl, I'm on HA, and I'm like, well, I'm a nipple licker. You ain't licking nipples. I can't even mess with you, bro. I can't even roll with you like that, man. You know what I mean? So there's something particularly curious about the identity being centered on that act. You know what I mean? But I think you're right that we do need to hold space for people to be able to acknowledge that, like, this is where I find pleasure. I still think that we can do that, and at the same time find some new language that isn't about top-bottom hierarchy, that isn't about that. There's got to be a way we can imagine something different for ourselves and our sexualities. Because I think that, I think about even the term bottom, all the stigma we talk about with bottom in our communities, bottom as a word has no positive connotation in our cultural canon. If somebody says they live in the bottom, they live in the hood. If somebody says they're on the bottom, they are in a bad place. You know what I mean? So then you take it in the gay community, it has this negative connotation. If somebody says they're on top, that has a positive connotation in all our culture. And we see that kind of show up in the gender stuff, right? You know what I mean? And so I think that we need to think about new language, not getting rid of the fact that I still like to be penetrated or I like to give dick or whatever, but to really figure out how can we name these things that don't invoke that stuff? What does that look like? I think that's the opportunity for us, particularly who are really invested in kind of like moving us forward as men sexually, emotionally, intimately, and also in a social justice framework, That's what I would say. I think I just went kind of ham. I'm sorry. So, if you are out there watching, which we are sure that you are, make sure you join us on Twitter Sunday, 1-2 for a conversation on this, the truth about tops and bottoms. Make sure you visit brunchwiththeboys.org where you can find out more information about this conversation and many more of the conversations that we have. You can follow us on Twitter at BrunchWTheBoys. This is a topic that we could talk about all day. We might even have a part 2 because I feel like Aaron and Kenyon are looking like, look, Chase is like, we got to talk some more about this.
Yeah, I could do it.
Because there's so much to be said, and make sure you comment below, and keep the conversation going. So this is going to conclude this episode, but we will see you in 2 weeks, and we will have much more to say. I want to thank all the brothers for being on here. Thank you, Aaron, for coming through. It's always awesome to have you on. Thank you, Jay. Thank you, Kenyon, and
thank you.
We'll see you soon, and we'll see you on Twitter, so we can have more about the thought. All right. Have a great day, and thank you for joining us for Brunch with the Boys.
Bye.
So give it up, mama. Under your panties in your bra. See you at the night. You must need a slice. Type A personality.